Good evening again, and welcome. Thank you for being here. My name is Paolo Mauro from the IMF's Fiscal Affairs Department, and I have the honor and the pleasure of welcoming you to this exciting and important event to launch the University of Chicago's Market Shaping Accelerator. The goal is to build on global successes in vaccine development. The Market Shaping Accelerator aims to speed up innovation to solve the world's most pressing challenges. To that end, it leverages the future purchasing power of governments, multilateral institutions, and philanthropies. The faculty directors of the Market Shaping Accelerator are Rachel Glenister and Michael Kramer, both from UChicago, and Christopher Snyder from Dartmouth. You will see them on stage this evening. I understand Rachel and Michael in the first session and Christopher in the second session. I'm sure that everyone here is as thrilled as I am to see stellar academics and influential policymakers in the room together, joining forces to make a real difference. This evening will be intellectually exciting. This initiative builds on the path-breaking research of several top-notch professors, including 2 Nobel Prize recipients and the Clark medalist. But this evening will also be important. Given the track record of the presenters, it's no exaggeration to say that we are witnessing history in the making. We are equally fortunate to have in the room a stellar cast of policymakers committed to make things happen. At the IMF, we work on and are extremely interested in policy proposals to promote innovation and global public goods, to overcome global externalities, and more generally, to foster a more resilient, green, and inclusive global economy. So we're delighted to host this event. I also understand that this event is supported, among others, by the Chicago Economic Society. So go Maroons. Allow me a couple of additional words to warmly welcome Rachel and Michael to the stage. I have admired their academic and policymaking contributions for 3 decades. Prior to joining UChicago, Rachel was the chief economist of the United Kingdom's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, previously known as DFID. Most important, earlier in her career, she was a much liked and highly respected colleague at the staff of the IMF for a few years, which makes us extremely proud. Michael was previously the Gates Professor of Developing Societies in the Department of Economics at Harvard, and was awarded the Nobel Prize in 2019 together with Esther Duflo and Abhijit Banerjee. And it's wonderful to welcome him back. He gave the Goody Lecture just a few months ago. Rachel and Michael, including through their work at the Poverty Action Lab, were among a handful of pioneers who transformed development economics from a sleepy and peripheral version of economic history to the current exciting, data-intensive, and operationally oriented discipline it is today. Their path-breaking work, for example, on advanced commitments against neglected diseases, saved literally hundreds of thousands of lives. Their work as academics, policymakers, innovators, and social entrepreneurs in development economics has achieved tangible results in vaccine development, deworming, safe drinking water, digital technology to improve productivity in smallholder farming, and poverty reduction more generally. Rachel, Michael, I'm excited to keep learning from you and to see you make even more important contributions to global well-being. Thanks for everything that you do. The floor is yours.
I'm delighted to welcome you all here to the launch of the University of Chicago's Market Shaping Accelerator. Climate change and pandemics both threaten tremendous damage to our economies and to our societies. Innovation is already helping to reduce emissions and protect us from pandemics. For example, the price of electricity from solar power fell 89% between 2009 and 2019. COVID-19 illustrated the huge value of novel mRNA vaccine technologies. But we need much more innovation, and unfortunately, under our current institutions, market incentives to invest in innovation to address these risks all too often fall short of social needs. In some cases, innovations create benefits, not just or even primarily for the buyer of the good. A good example of this would be innovations that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Existing incentives to invest in these technologies are inadequate because, for example, buyers of green cement would be unwilling to fully pay for the carbon benefits, and hence incentives to invest in the innovation to develop the green cement will similarly be inadequate to match social need. There are also many cases in which innovations are not patentable or are not otherwise easy to protect through first-mover advantages. And it's just very easy for subsequent competitors to enter the market as well. And in those cases, it may be necessary to augment existing incentives for R&D with additional ones that could be created through public support. Another case is where pricing of innovations will be subject to social and political constraints that might deter investment. So, for example, in the midst of pandemics, there are likely to be constraints, and perhaps very appropriately, there are constraints on pricing of vaccines. And while those constraints may well be warranted, they create a gap between the social value of innovations and the commercial rewards that investors can reap, and thus at least potentially a case for public support for innovation. Market-shaping mechanisms are designed to harness the energy and creativity of the private sector to develop innovations in these cases, for climate change and pandemics. And they're designed to align the commercial incentives for innovation with its social importance by tying the payments to outputs. So, for example, advanced market commitments establish legally binding contracts that commit the funders to help finance the purchase of a large quantity of a specific product if it's developed. Advanced market commitments and other pull mechanisms, which involve paying for outputs and outcomes, can shape markets to reward socially useful innovations and send a clear demand signal for high-return social innovations. The Accelerator builds on our earlier experience. Rachel, Chris Snyder, and I were involved in the design of the $1.5 billion pneumococcal vaccine advanced market commitment. Since that was put in place, 3 vaccines for the strains of pneumococcus that are common in low and middle-income countries have been developed. Hundreds of millions of doses of those vaccines have been distributed, and an estimated 700,000 lives have been saved thanks to those vaccines. The rate of coverage of pneumococcal vaccines in low and middle-income countries covered by Gavi converged to the global rate 5 years faster than, for example, for the rotavirus vaccine, which was also supported by Gavi, but didn't have an advanced market commitment. So I think the case of the pneumococcus advanced market commitment shows that these approaches can work in the vaccine space, but I think they have much broader potential. Industrial decarbonization, carbon removal, broad-spectrum antivirals, and many others. And those are the issues that this initiative will seek to make progress on.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Paolo, for the generous introduction. My task today is to tell you a little bit more about how the Accelerator is planning to work. So Operation Warp Speed and the Inflation Reduction Act are just two examples of very significant investments that governments have made recently to promote innovation in the climate space and the pandemic space. And policymakers have used a very wide range of tools to spur that kind of innovation. You see tax credits, you see grants, you see subsidies. And increasingly, governments and foundations are turning to market-shaping instruments, partly in order to leverage the power of the private sector and the innovation of the private sector. But designing these tools is really quite tricky. You need to understand the specific market that you're trying to shape. You need to understand this market structure quite well. And at the Market Shaping Accelerator, our objective is to support governments, philanthropists, and the private sector who are trying to use these tools and try and help shape that from really the early brainstorming all the way through to the final contracts and implementation. We plan to get our hands really dirty by looking, delving into the costs, the metrics, and the contract clauses that you need to design these mechanisms well. Because an effective market shaping requires an understanding of the economics of a specific market, measurement challenges, and also expertise on how to write contracts. It therefore requires a real, cross-cutting collaboration between economists, lawyers, policymakers. And this is exactly what we did in the pneumococcal case. And so we hope to build on that experience to generate more of these collaborations to spur innovation. There are a huge number of challenges that the world's facing and that could benefit from market-shaping approaches. But for the time being, we're concentrating on two very large ones, climate change and pandemic preparedness. Both of these are examples of market failure at really a grand scale. So you've got, the externalities that we're all familiar with climate change and also pandemics. So you've got the traditional problems of spurring innovation and the fact that there are spillovers of learning from, one person investing to other firms learning from it. But you've also got the problem that we all benefit when one person takes action to protect themselves from a pandemic or protect themselves or reduce emissions. So that means that innovation is massively underinvested in. Just as, to put some numbers on the problem, Chris Snyder, Brandon Tan, who's here at the IMF, and I have recently produced a paper looking at the probabilities of future pandemics and the costs, and estimate that the world is losing in expectation, i.e. on average every year, between 800 billion and 900 billion to pandemics. So we're going to be losing that amount of money every year to future pandemics. And similarly, the numbers for the cost of global warming are similarly in the tens of trillions of dollars. We're already talking, this is our launch, but we've already started talking to policymakers, I see some of them in the audience, and funders about things like green cement, clean hydrogen, a coronavirus vaccine. But we think there are probably more great ideas out there of where market shaping could potentially be a useful tool. And so next week, we're launching a $2 million innovation challenge to help surface some of those ideas in climate and biosecurity problems in particular. And so we want to hear from you. Perhaps there's an idea that you're excited about or a problem in your supply chain that you want to solve. So take a look at the Market Shaping Accelerator website, and you will see how to sign up for the competition. Markets are a great tool for innovation. They aggregate information, they signal where demand is, and they help allocate resources efficiently. But they need to be shaped if they are to deliver the innovations that we need to tackle climate change and prepare for the next pandemic. The Market Shaping Accelerator is here to support that effort. I'm now going to hand over to Chris Snyder, who is my co-faculty director at the Market Shaping Accelerator, to moderate the first panel. Chris is an industrial organization theorist who at Dartmouth College, and he and I have worked extensively on the pneumococcal vaccine, which that you've heard about, but also during the midst of the COVID pandemic, when we were all, along with some of the other people who you'll see today, were working to shape the market for COVID vaccines. Over to you, Chris.
Panel should come up. Thanks for that kind introduction, Rachel. Bono, Bruce Springsteen, Taylor Swift. If you are a fan of popular music, you'd be so excited to be attending a concert by just one, if not the whole group. That's the excitement I feel to be moderating this panel with some of the great minds in economics. And we're delighted in the Market Shaping Accelerator to have these panelists actually serving the team, both as faculty directors and expert advisors. The panelists have all contributed seminal academic research on topics that are relevant to the Market Shaping Accelerator on innovation, procurement, mechanism design, high-tech markets. But they've also rolled up their sleeves and made contributions to public policy, whether for providing the framework for the advanced market commitment you heard about, or advising national economic policy in France, or modernizing US antitrust guidelines in tech markets. To provide more specific introductions, to my immediate side here, Michael Kramer has been introduced. He's a university professor in economics at the University of Chicago and a Nobel Prize recipient in 2019. Jean Tirole is the honorary chairman of the foundation, the Jean-Jacques Lafont Toulouse School of Economics and the Institute for Advanced Study in Toulouse, and is the scientific director of the Toulouse School of Economics Partnership, and was the 2014 Nobel Prize recipient. Susan Athey is the Economics of Technology professor at the Stanford Graduate School of Business. She currently serves as a chief economist in the antitrust division at the Department of Justice. I can't announce her Nobel Prize yet, and I don't want to jinx it, but she was, as you heard, the recipient of the Clark Medal that the American Economic Association gives to the economists under 40, contributing the most significant to economic knowledge. So I'm going to ask, starting with Michael Kramer, a series of questions. We're going to a couple questions for each panelist, and then we'll go to questions and answers from the audience at the end. So we'll start with Michael. The whole concept behind the Market Shaping Accelerator is to encourage innovation in neglected areas. So these are areas where the social benefits are very large, but the commercial incentives aren't there, so there are gaps there. Now we have patents. When you think about innovation and government policy towards innovation, we have patents, and that's a standard way of addressing the problem that copycats might come and take the returns from the innovator and dull their incentives. What do you see as some systematic reasons for such gaps that patents alone can't fill?
Well, there are many cases in which important innovations aren't patentable and aren't easy to protect otherwise with first mover advantages. So that the difficulty of protecting innovations with patents and the ease of entry for others is something that actually increases the social benefits of innovations like that, but it reduces commercial incentives to develop those innovations. So that's one area. Another example, I mentioned a couple of other examples in the introduction, but another example would be if you're thinking about activities that are typically conducted by governments. So for example, governments often fund agricultural extension. that could be very important in dealing with climate change. But if there are better ways of doing that, somebody innovates on that, they're not likely to get rewards for that innovation commensurate with the social value. And I think, let me mention one other area in which patents have, while very important, have limitations. The idea of a patent, of course, is to incentivize innovation by providing innovators with a temporary monopoly. The issue with that is that it excludes those who can't afford to pay the monopoly price, but whose value on the innovation is above the marginal cost of producing it, and therefore who would ideally get access to this from that access. Deadweight loss in the language of economists, but if you're thinking about a life-saving product like a drug or vaccine, something with tremendous human cost. And that creates a trade-off between the dynamic incentives for R&D, which are very important, but also access to the innovations, and market-shaping mechanisms like advanced market commitments offer a way to help address that tension by finding a different way to pay for the innovation that actually promotes not only innovation but also access. For example, a lump sum purchase price for large-scale access.
So let me just follow up. Governments and NGOs and philanthropists are not ignorant of the fact that there are these gaps, and so they're supplying funds to try to fill some of those with extra funding. The funding tends to come in the form of push funding. So in the development pipeline, grants and research and development inputs are funded. The Market Shaping Accelerator is focusing more on a less commonly used form of funding, so-called pull funding, where you offer the incentives at the end of the pipeline for successful products, say in the form of a prize or a subsidy, or maybe a more finely tuned mechanism such as an advanced market commitment. What makes pull funding a useful contribution for incentivizing innovation?
So I think in general, a combination of push and pull financing tends to be effective. So for example, if you think about the US system for pharmaceutical innovation, on the one hand, there's the NIH supporting and providing a lot of upfront funding, including for basic research, for example. But that's complemented by pharmaceutical firms which are motivated by the prospect of a market for a successful product, and therefore, and the combination of these different types of funding produces a very vibrant and dynamic sector. The issue is that while there's a big pull from the prospect of a blockbuster drug in the US pharmaceutical market, there are other markets that are very important for social needs where that pull is absent. We need push in those, and it's important that we continue to fund that, not least for basic research, but we need to complement that with incentives to develop actual products that consumers will use. And just to be specific, what are some of the reasons why pull is useful as part of the mix? One feature that I think is desirable is that with pull funding, so rewarding successful products rather than paying up front, the funding, the financial commitments that the pull funders make only get incurred if the product is actually developed and used. They're also firm and technology agnostic. So if with a lot of upfront subsidies, or perhaps with all upfront subsidies, there's to be a decision of which technological approaches are most promising, which firms have the best are best to fund. Often it's very difficult for funders to make those decisions because they don't have full information. Pull funding lets each firm decide whether to put its money where its mouth is, so to speak. Do they want to invest their own money and invest in this? If there's a sufficient financial reward for success, then they'll make that decision based on their own judgment about whether the technology is ready. And then a final element is that pull funding, or at least some forms of pull funding like advanced market commitments, help incentivize products that consumers will actually value. So with upfront push funding, there's the risk that you develop technology that works in the lab, but doesn't appeal to consumers. For example, there are a lot of great successes with agricultural R&D, producing things that farmers will use, but there are also examples where funds get sunk into a product, but for whatever reason, farmers don't want to use it. Advanced market commitments provide a subsidy that matches a purchase by either an individual consumer or, in the case of vaccines, governments buying on behalf of consumers. And that incentivizes firms to develop products that the purchasers actually want. Those are some of the advantages of having a substantial pull element in the mix of support for research and development.
Thanks. So let's move over to Jean Terrell. Jean, you have contributed. You've written the textbook on industrial organization, and you've written the book on procurement. I've actually read every word of both of those books, probably 3 times by now. You've written some of the seminal work on incentivizing innovation. What are some of the key insights, either from your own research or from the general literature, that should be foremost in our minds in our work as on the Market Shaping Accelerator and the policymakers that we work with?
Okay, does it work? Well, thank you, Chris. And before I answer this question about what we have learned about procurement, let me just say that, step back a little bit and say that any initiative which is socially responsible originate in a failure, in a twin failure, actually. The first is a failure of the market. Rachel mentioned that. It's very important. There are many reasons why markets fail: externalities, internalities, market power, asymmetric information, and so on and so forth. But there's always a government failure somewhere, because the government fails to actually address the market failure. And that's due to many causes. It may be due to lack of commitment. It may be due to capture or electioneering. It may be due to many jurisdictions. One important thing for the kind of thing we are going to discuss today is the fact that we cannot reach the right scale because there are many jurisdictions which free ride on each other. So that's very important. So if you want to understand the best response to the situation, you really have to introduce to think about why the market is failing, why the state is failing. And of course, you have to learn, as Rachel emphasized, you really have to learn about the specific situation you are facing. My own experience in policy, in competition policy or in regulation or in banking or whatever, is always that you have to learn about the situation at stake. 2 illustrations of this twin failure, actually in MSA territory. I don't know if I can call that neglected innovations, but in climate change, that was already mentioned. One of the biggest failure, of course, state failure, is the absence of a carbon price. We all know that in almost every country, especially in Asia, in the US and elsewhere. And that's because of politics, of course, and also primes with commitment to a price for tomorrow. So we need more than ever actually disruptive innovation. It's very important. In the space of disease, of course, there are many neglected diseases, and that was mentioned by Michael, because there may be a small number of patients, like in orphan diseases. There may be a limited ability to pay, like for LDCs, drug for LDCs, externalities, like for antibiotics and vaccines. And they create a very big wedge, bigger than usual, between the social and the private value. So what have we learned about procurement? The first thing is not going to be very useful. We have learned it's very complex. It's very complex because there are lots of informational issues, moral hazard, adverse selection. There are commitment primes on both sides, on the buyer side and the seller side. What we have seen in the 80s and 90s was an incentive revolution, both in the field of economics but also in practice. We realized that we could not go on like this with very low-powered incentive schemes. Costs were too high and innovation too low. So we had to make the firms more accountable for their performance. So performance-based regulation, at least on those dimensions that the firm can control. Of course, it's easier to control the technology than maybe demand. There are some aspects of demand you can control, but many aspects you cannot control as a firm. So the idea was to really introduce those high-powered incentive schemes. But we also learned about the limits of it, both in theory but in practice as well. So the first thing is that there is no free lunch. If you have high-powered incentive schemes, that means you also create rents, simply because, you know, if I'm residual claimant for my cost savings, I'm also residual claimant for any piece of luck that I'm encountering. You know, if I have low costs, you know, I get a big rent out of that. There are broader limits of high-powered incentive schemes. If you introduce them, you have to be aware of poor quality. You have to be aware of capture. You are facing even worse commitment primes on the government side, the purchaser side. So you have to think about that because you have to introduce countermeasures. Doesn't mean high-powered incentive schemes are wrong, but you really need to complement them with other measures because you're introducing new issues. You must introduce markets. By the way, if you think about markets, one way of thinking about markets is that you're really reducing the asymmetries of information, which are so big. I mean, it's pretty clear in auctions, for example, but you know, in other areas as well. And you have to describe the products, you know, if you want to do procurement. And actually, Michael mentioned that. And you have to give a description of the product, right? Otherwise, you're going to get it wrong. Not the approach, that's very important. You want to be neutral on the approach on producing this product, but in the end, you have to describe a product, a measurable objective, and you have to think about the benefit. And you know, one of the difficulties we have learned is, of course, how you think about the benefit. And for drugs, it's a medical benefit, but you know, you can apply that to a bridge or an innovation or anything. And what you want to avoid is Me Too innovation. You want to have something that people are willing to pay for, where you create a big surplus, at least for some people. But how do you measure that if you are selling at marginal cost, if you have zero copay or anything like that? The answer is you can't. So either you try to measure more properly, which is not easy to do, especially you know, if you don't. Otherwise, you need some market test. And the market test is very important, but it is distortive at the same time because you have to raise the price to levels where people tell you, yes, I want to buy that. So, you know, in a very quick thing, there are many things we have learned, but it's a difficult exercise, and you know, that's the lessons we have learned as well.
So, are there any insurmountable theoretical challenges, or what are maybe the big practical difficulties that you see that theory is going to have a hard time solving?
Oh, there are many. I mean, for the students in the room, you could spend your career on that, of course. But you know, let me mention four. The first thing is to come back to what Michael was saying is this intertemporal mix of incentives. So we have the 3 Ps: push, pull, and procure, right? So you push more at an early stage, usually through some general purpose untargeted subsidies, which create some of the primes that Michael mentioned. Then you try to pull at a later stage once you have a more precise view of what you might be buying. So either specific subsidies, like for clinical trial grants, or AMC, or prizes, and then you can still procure. Then you know what you are buying because it already exists. So you negotiate a contract or maybe an IP transfer. We don't completely understand the full mix of all those. So we have some deciphering keys, of course. So, you know, you have to describe the target, for example, fully if you are using a price. You know, you really have to know exactly what you want to buy. The AMC is a little bit more robust to that, actually, but you still have to have a fair idea of what you want to buy. And of course, you know, IP is so popular because you don't really need to specify what you are going to buy because, you know, as Adam Smith and others have noted, you have some kind of proportionality, very rough one, between profit and social welfare, which is created. Second issue is how do you do, maybe Michael, Chris, and you know, Rachel know about that, but how do you do AMC when you have multiple innovations, when you have complements, for example? When you have a quality ladder, well, you know, how do you do that? I mean, you have some ideas about doing that, but do you want to have a target and then let the market participant, the innovators, get together? form a pool, for example. We have been working a lot on pools, for example. Is that what you want, or you want to try to micromanage the industry? I don't know. I mean, the answer is third challenge for you is, what currency? You are going to pay the innovator in some way. So, you have to choose a payer, and you have to choose a currency. So you can use, for example, user pay. Maybe a co-pay might be an example. You use a market test. That's useful when the quality or the demand curve is unknown, as I was mentioning earlier. But as I said, the level of the price has to be high enough to tease out the demand curve. You can use a taxpayer, which is nice because that doesn't distort demand. Then the price is low. There is a social cost of public funds, and there is no incentive benefit. But there are other ways. So, for example, something which is being recommended by the European Commission right now for antibiotics. They had this week some recommendation, but that was also recommended at some point in the 2018 US Revamp Act, was to actually have a voucher, a transferable exclusivity extension. So basically you get a voucher, the innovator gets a voucher, and that can be sold to someone who's going to buy 3 or 6 months or a year more exclusivity. You have to do it right first, because there are many ways of doing it wrong. And often the things that you hear are wrong. But the deadweight loss per dollar collected may not be that high. My first reaction, I don't want that kind of stuff. But if the generics industry is not that competitive, then the deadweight loss per dollar collected is actually quite low. Actually, in our data, we have done some research, it's lower than 1. For all countries in Europe. So we are still working on that just to make sure that's correct. And finally, I'm taking too much time, I'm sorry, but let me mention the issue of building a coalition. So I was mentioning that we have a problem of jurisdiction. When I see the UK or Sweden trying to encourage antibiotics, I think it's crazy. I mean, some of it is procurement, so of existing stuff, that's different. But if it's a real innovation, that's complicated. And innovation is a global public good. So how do you do it? Because there's a very strong incentive to do free riding. Actually, if you look at this from a cyclical perspective, it may be the case that the coalition of buyers cannot get a better deal than when facing a for-profit monopolist, which is awful. So we need actually independent sponsor in discouraging this free riding, and this is an area of research we must develop as well if we want to reach the scale we want to reach. Sorry.
Thanks. I'm going to leave the hardest questions for Susan Athey. So the two spheres that the market shaping accelerator are going to work in first, pandemic preparedness and climate change mitigation. In a sense, there's not an existing market. They're going to require creating markets. How do we get this right using your insights from mechanism design, the work you've done?
Yeah, I think just stepping back, so I came to these two problems, so the two big market shaping things I've worked on. One is in climate and one was in the COVID vaccine procurement. And in both of them, I felt like we drew a lot on values and lessons from the market design literature in general. A key value there was, it sounds simple, but every problem is different. And we coined the term within the market design literature of economist as engineer, which basically we translate that as you need to understand all of the institutions of your environment and you need to understand the problem you're solving. So actually I saw Larry Osterbill in the audience. We've worked on things in market design like designing auctions for spectrum, auctions for natural resources, procurement of natural resources, procurement problems. We've looked at matching students to schools. Each of those individual cases required saying, what is the actual problem we're solving here? And somebody might come to me and say, hey, help me design an auction. And a lot of times the answer is, I'm glad you called me, but actually you don't really need an auction. Your problem is not one of eliciting dispersed information. Your problem is something else, and that's not even the right category of answer. despite the fact that we've built up market design and I think now market shaping, there's really kind of a Venn diagram between the two, we've built it up like one case study at the time. At the same time, each of those case studies has led to both brilliant and path-breaking theory and empirical work, but also generalizable insights that go from one place to the other. So insights about information, about incentives, about agency, really that are drawing from the core areas of information economics. But it turns out, even though you think it was all solved in Jean's books, when you come to a new problem, in fact, you realize it wasn't actually all solved for your specific problem.
So now you're working in the government, and so you have a new perspective on things. Do you have any insights on what policymakers might need to know to help shape markets?
Yeah, well, so of course, government has an entirely different set of instruments. It's been really interesting for me to think about, like, you know, I've been working bottom up, like one case study at the time, and now I'm sort of thinking about setting policies that shape an entire economy. And I think there's a lot to be gained from thinking from both bottom up and top down at the same time. Really having understood one by one how the cases work helps you guide policy generally. But I would come back to, you know, in thinking about market shaping and even answering your original problem, you know, there's a set of common questions that are a good place to start. So one of the big questions in market shaping is like push versus pull. And Michael talked earlier about all the benefits of pull, and those benefits are enormous, extremely important, you know, providing not just picking winners, but having real high-powered incentives to pull through people's behavior. But yet, the two big market shaping problems I worked with, both of them came to an answer that wasn't just pull. In fact, almost the opposite. And it came from asking the questions in each of the cases, what is the really important thing we need to get people to do? So for the COVID vaccines, at the point you came in, people were already, based on push funding and other, you know, social beliefs and values, people were innovating. They were trying to create and invent COVID vaccines. There was actually a lot of innovation, really, without too much intervention, just on the basic science side. But it was very clear that without strong incentives, we weren't going to build enough manufacturing capacity. There was going to be this window in time when it was incredibly valuable to get vaccines out quickly. And so what we really needed was enough manufacturing capacity. And it was going to cost hundreds of millions or billions of dollars to build that manufacturing capacity, and you were going to have to repurpose assets that had other profitable uses to do so. So social responsibility was only going to go so far. Social responsibility may get you tens of millions of dollars, but it doesn't necessarily get you to shut down a profitable factory and, you know, forego hundreds of millions of dollars to do something different with it. You actually need financial incentives. You're talking to the finance people, not the doctors and scientists when you're going to build factories. So we really focused in on the incentives to expand capacity. And the fact that we were going to need to build capacity at risk. And in that problem, what it turned out is that there were really heterogeneous probabilities of success for different candidates. And so our economic analysis suggested that, you know, a combination of push and pull was going to be more likely and more efficient to get even firms that thought there was some chance of failure, a bigger chance of failure, to really invest in manufacturing capacity. So this was, you know, being very open-minded, and even though, you know, our team, which was Michael and Chris, we were all coming into this with the high-powered incentives mindset, we still proposed the best solutions for the problem, which was a mix. And then similarly, when we're thinking about incentives for carbon removal, by digging into the institutions, we found that one of the problems there was that people didn't have enough early stage financing. And when you talk to the people who might finance companies that invest in carbon removal and innovate in carbon removal, there's this big problem that, like, carbon removal is such a funny product. You can't go out and do focus groups for like, how much do you like different kinds of carbon removal, right? Like, who's your customer? Your customer's a government, it's a corporate who has very fuzzy objectives. Their PR, they can rise and fall with sentiment and budget constraints of the day, whatever the crisis is. So, financiers just couldn't wrap their heads around how to make a long-term investment for something without a clear customer. So in that case, raising $1 billion and committing it to purchase carbon removal simplified the innovators' conversation with their financiers, because they could say, there's my customer. That customer has $1 billion they're going to spend on this, and that customer has outlined what's going to feed into their demand. So now we have a predictable and understandable customer, and we can then have a conversation with financiers about investing in carbon removal. And so that required really an understanding of what the problem was that was being solved, and actually this $1 billion has this sort of, it helps also solve a chicken and egg problem. If the investors aren't sure they're going to really follow through with this, they don't really learn about the technology. There are sort of scale economies for a financer to understand a technology. But if they see this $1 billion there, then they say, okay, I might invest in a couple of these firms. So I'm going to hire an associate who has some expertise, and I'm really going to learn about the technology. So, understanding whose incentives you were trying to shape and what information problems and chicken and egg problems, scale economies you needed to solve, that helped determine the nature of the market shaping.
Why don't you join me in thanking the panel for their remarkable comments.
Okay, so I am going to moderate this policy panel with an amazing group of people who are trying to put some of these ideas into practice. So we have Kath Bremner, who is Chief Strategy and Operations Officer at Impacts. I knew Kath in the British government, where we worked on trying to design some advanced market commitments. She was Acting Director General in the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, and tasked with developing the UK's next net zero strategy and international climate and energy policy. And she's also an advisor for us at MSA. So Jane Flagel is Market Development and Policy Lead at Stripe Frontier. You've already heard Susan and others talk about this work that they're doing to get more direct air capture and permanent carbon removal. She was previously Senior Director of Industrial Emissions at the White House. And Matt Hepburn is Senior Advisor at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, and he was COVID vaccine lead for Operation Warp Speed. So again, we've got this mix of climate and pandemics. So let me turn to you first, Kath. I know you've thought a lot about the where the private sector is already doing a lot of funding of innovation, and what areas are neglected and need particular stimulus for innovation. So what areas do you think we ought to be focusing on at the Market Shaping Accelerator? What's neglected?
Thank you, and it's a real honor to be here today with these amazing brains in the room, helping us address what I call wicked problems in a policy sense, protecting us against future pandemics and addressing climate change. So to get to net zero, and I was fortunate enough to be the UK government's representative when the G7 agreed to net zero. I was chairing that negotiation. Time is the issue. In the next decade, not only do we have to do push and pull, we've got to procure at scale. And so when I've been talking to Rachel and the team about this market shaping accelerator, I'm like, yes, please, let's do this. And so if you think about net zero, there's 5 key sectors to get there. Energy, transport. So energy, we kind of know what to do. We know the renewables, we know the system, and a lot of that innovation has occurred, but we're not 100% there. I would say in energy, some of the really difficult areas where the market shaping accelerator could make a real difference is around So grids, but not just the infrastructure of grids. We're going to be getting energy from batteries. We're going to be putting it on our roofs. We don't know how to balance the grids, and we need lots of smart technology around that. So that's a really important area. Green hydrogen we've talked about a little bit, but I think that is a really, difficult, both in terms of the technology development, but also getting to scale. The next area is around transport, and so we talk. Lots of people talk about electric vehicles here, but there's less talked about in terms of industrial processes. So this is green. So in the making of steel and cement and concrete, for example, we actually produce carbon through the chemical process. Is there another way that we can make green steel, green cement? We don't know that, and we have to do it very quickly. People talk about aviation, and so is there a different type of fuel for aviation? Electric planes, long haul. I'm from Australia. I don't think they'll work, but if we could find a way to have, what people don't talk about actually a lot is shipping. So 3% of greenhouse gas emissions globally is from diesel, big generators and shipping. Can we find a zero carbon shipping? So this is the kind of pull mechanisms that I think a market shaping accelerator could do. And then just two others I'll mention. So we often, when we talk about getting to net zero, people talk about energy or EVs. That's kind of what people know. But actually, if you think about cooling and heating, so as we are unfortunately entering a century of climate change, it's likely we'll hit 1.5 degrees and go beyond it. I worry about places like Indonesia. So I was fortunate enough last year to meet the Indonesian energy minister. And he said 6% of our 100 million people population have access to cooling, have air conditioning. But NOAA estimate that there'll be 40 days a year in Indonesia with climate change where the wet bulb temperature is such that the human body won't be able to cool themselves without cooling because it'll be so humid and hot. So how can we create low carbon net zero cooling for Indonesia, for places like India? So I think that's really critical. And the final area, which Rachel and I tried very hard when we were in the UK government, is around agriculture. And so, again, it's not often talked about, but 25% of the carbon saving potential is not only in reforestation and agriculture, but we're going to need drought resistant crops and other types of crops. So are we doing something there? Again, coming from Australia, eat a lot of meat, but maybe we need protein-based meats or other ways to deal with methane. So there's a number of ideas, if you like, across all sectors of the economy where market shaping accelerator could make a difference.
Great, thanks. Matt, Chris and I and Brandon Tan have been working on, estimating the size of the problem that you're trying to solve, which, and I mentioned earlier, 800 to 900 billion a year in expectation for pandemics. It's great to see, some things leaking out about the Biden administration being committed to working on things about PPE and vaccines and diagnostics. Obviously, I'm not going to ask you to leak anything today, but what do you see as the opportunities? Where do you think market shaping could work in this sort of plethora of pandemic preparedness?
Yeah, I think there's a simple answer is quite a bit. And we can move on. But climate change is really important, so I'm very happy to hear from my fellow panelists because I really appreciate what you're doing as well. We're solving these complex problems. I'm actually really happy to be here, and I'm really happy to have this conversation with this audience. I'm really happy you've selected pandemic preparedness as such an important problem. One of the lessons for me as an infectious diseases physician, I'd been working on pandemic preparedness and biomedical innovation my whole career, but we've always approached pandemic preparedness from a public health and a healthcare standpoint. And a fundamental lesson of this pandemic was that when we as a society were at our best is when we had the whole of society working together. And I'm a government guy, you're going to say super cliche, but Where we have been most successful is when we took public health and healthcare professionals, coupled with economists, coupled with logisticians, and put a team together that could solve that problem. So the economic thinking that we are doing now for future pandemics, I think is going to be how we do so much better. And if we retract back to our pre-pandemic pattern of just thinking the government's going to solve our problems, public health and the healthcare system are going to do just great, I think that's going to be very flawed thinking. I think, therefore, bringing that market-shaping energy and thoughtfulness to solve this problem is absolutely essential. I think I'm happy to talk about a couple ideas, and maybe a bit of a government perspective. And to start with the comment that where we are at our best as governments, in my humble opinion, is when we are enabling the best of our society to succeed. And we heard that on the prior panel, this idea of markets creating the innovation that can truly solve our complex problems. And how is government enabling rather than inhibiting that? What we're trying to do at the Office of Science and Technology Policy, too, as we think about future pandemics, is to say, what are things that are essential that governments can, should, and will have to do? And focusing our taxpayer dollars on those things, and therefore, but leaving up to markets to do great things, but shaping them, and that's the point. A really good example is regulatory and standards, so that I think that's inherently a government role. So that to the extent that we regulate vaccines, that we provide standards for how vaccines are manufactured and produced, and the better that we do at that, it floats all boats for innovation, if you will, that are making next generation vaccines. So that makes sense from a government standpoint. What it doesn't make sense is that if there is incentives that are already in place to drive massive innovation, maybe that takes less taxpayer dollars, and that takes more of a, hey, I wonder if we can grab or ride the wave on that type of trend to do better. A really good example is that there is a lot of market incentive now in the pharmaceutical industry to develop oncology products, or specifically products that influence your immune system to kill cancer, and whether those are vaccines or immune stimulators or whatever they are. All of that effort can be leveraged for future pandemic preparedness. If we are going to imagine a future where we can make personalized vaccines for cancer, the manufacturing capability, far distributed, scaled, and very capable, well, that'd be great for the next pandemic or any outbreak that we're trying to deal with in the next few years. But that doesn't necessarily require a ton of push incentives and early biomedical investment. That's already occurring. We just have to pivot that and ride that wave to be most successful. The previous panel talked about that with these individual problems. There's not a one solution so that we'll incentivize all vaccines. It's a very fit for purpose type of approach. But what we're trying to do as a government to combine that fit for purpose in both push and pull. As the previous panel said, we have push incentives. The government does a vast amount of early biomedical research investments. We also have great opportunities for advanced purchase and procurement. We have the VA healthcare system as example, so that we can create both the push and pull, and we can figure out, if we're at our best, what are the right tools at the right times to create that market shaping. So I'm very excited about when we do pandemic preparedness. It's not just a single investment or a single type of investments, but it's a diversity of all these different tools that we can use. But always with that mind towards the government doesn't solve all of our problems. What we do is we can incentivize the best of society to solve them.
Great. Well, that is the perfect segue, because we've been talking a lot about government, but government can't do everything. And Jane, you're working on how to, how to shape markets with private sector funding, which is really awesome to see. At Frontier, you've put together a coalition of private sector organizations providing funding to shape the market for permanent direct air air capture, and we've heard a little bit about it already today. But have you got tips on sort of, implementing this in practice? Because, that's what you've been working on over the last few months or years.
Thanks, Rachel. We at Frontier are the first customers for permanent carbon removal, and I think some of the first customers of the market shaping Accelerator. Rachel, Susan, and Chris are all on our board of advisors, and so for better or worse, any mistakes that we make, we can blame on you. And you may, I think to your question, Rachel, I'm going to complicate this a bit because while I am working in the private sector to engage in what I think is critically important market shaping, carbon removal in particular is an area where the government is going to have to do a lot. And I'll say more about that in a moment, but I want to really underscore the importance of that for this problem in particular. 5 seconds on carbon removal. Carbon removal is a set of approaches that pull carbon dioxide that is already in the atmosphere out of the atmosphere and store it permanently. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has made it quite clear that we have effectively no chance of limiting the worst effects of climate change without carbon dioxide removal at quite a significant scale on the order of gigatons of carbon removal each year, which is very, very large. Susan sort of stole the bottom line here, which is that why advanced market commitment in the carbon removal domain, the opacity about who the customer will be, where the revenue will come from, for an activity that is fundamentally about providing a public good. Unlike renewable electricity, where you're producing electricity that someone will pay for, in carbon removal, you're providing a social good of reduced climate impacts, and so that opacity was inhibiting financing of early carbon removal projects and of innovation in carbon removal more broadly. We're learning a lot, things that I hope will both inform additional private sector market shaping activities and ultimately public sector activities as well. And we're seeing a lot of exciting momentum in the private sector around permanent carbon removal. But existing markets are incredibly small. Even our $1 billion commitment is nowhere near the scale that will be needed to achieve our climate objectives. And just to put a finer point on this and to underscore my case for the role of government here, if we were able to get to a world where carbon dioxide removal cost $100 per ton, and that is an if, that's where, I'm optimistic, but that's an optimistic goal. And if the world needs, say, 5 gigatons of carbon removal by 2050, that is $500 billion per year in demand. And the private sector alone is just not going to accommodate that. So ultimately, the government is going to need to step in to stimulate demand, which it can do in several ways, but I just want to underscore that is critical in this area. Still, the private sector and private sector action today is incredibly important, in part because early customers are helping to shape the market in several ways. First, we are seeing we haven't yet announced procurements in the form of offtakes, but the existence of the pull itself has already catalyzed quite a lot of innovation. We're seeing incredible growth in applications for our pre-purchases and offtakes of carbon removal, just as a consequence of the existence of the AMC. I started working on carbon removal in 2011, and at the time it was basically a handful of academics thinking about the idea, and today there are, by some counts, 1,000 companies working on carbon dioxide removal, which is super exciting. We also are, outside of the pull, in a position now to be identifying knowledge gaps in the field and helping to facilitate addressing those gaps. So Frontier put out a knowledge gaps report recently, identifying where we see from our perch in the field key scientific and technological needs. And we're using that not just to help inform the other private sector actors and philanthropies and governments to invest in innovation perhaps in a push mode in those areas. We also are helping to create new institutions that are going to be critical for a successful and thriving carbon removal market. A good example of this is earlier This year, we helped to co-found a Carbon Removal Institute and Carbon Removal Alliance, which is a coalition of nascent carbon removal suppliers and some buyers who are working to develop and advocate for much more robust public policy as pertains to carbon removal, which is really sorely needed in this space. And the one other thing that I think we're doing in addition to the pull itself is sort of steering. So we're in a position, because this field is so early, to help establish norms. We talk a lot in innovation policy about technological and economic valleys of death, but there are very real social valleys of death confronting carbon removal. It's really critically important that we make investments in this area in a way that helps build public trust and public confidence in these technologies over time. And we're able to sort of, through our purchasing and our criteria for purchasing, incentivize innovation that's aligned with broader societal values and objectives, including, for example, requiring community engagement of project developers. Very briefly, a couple of lessons that pertain mostly to the actual purchasing. Once again, Susan stole my thunder, but the first thing I was going to say is that we learned very quickly how important it was to tailor your market-shaping toolkit to the particular problem you're trying to solve. One thing that's different from some of the vaccine discussions we've been having relative to carbon removal is that in carbon removal, most of these technology providers are startups and in some cases academics coming out of labs, and they do not have the balance sheets to finance carbon removal projects themselves. They need to secure the financing. So we need to be designing our procurement in a way that's bankable for them. And so that is like a sort of a different thing that we've had to really focus on. Second, and I think Jean said this, sort of the focus on outcome, not technology, is incredibly important for carbon removal, in part because the field is so nascent. So we have taken at Frontier a criteria-based approach to defining what carbon removal is. There's a very wide diversity of solutions. In fact, we are seeing, as we've now gone through, I think, 5 or 6 cycles of buying carbon removal, new approaches to doing this every year. So we really are very focused on a criteria-based approach. Another lesson in carbon removal, I think again related to the nascency of the field, is it's really important on price for us to not be optimizing for lowest cost tons of removal today. That's because while lots of these technologies have sort of different intercepts, they have different slopes too. And what's important for the field and for the climate is that we have low-cost, scalable carbon removal in the future. So if we were just selecting for the stuff that's cheapest today, we may in fact be down selecting for a highly expensive and limited option. Relatedly, I think we're quite focused on supporting a risk-adjusted portfolio of solutions. The goal of what we're doing is to help figure out what will and won't work at scale. So some of these approaches are going to fail, and in fact, that's fine and good as long as the overall portfolio performs. And so as part of what we're trying to do is ensure that no one company or no one pathway dominates our overall purchasing portfolio today. And the last thing I'll say is in carbon removal in particular, and then for carbon accounting more broadly, we have to sort of find a way to avoid false precision and manage uncertainty and manage irreducible uncertainty. We have to move from a binary of like a ton was delivered or a ton was not delivered to understanding uncertainty in probabilistic terms. And just to be like very concrete about this, it's entirely plausible that some of the approaches to carbon removal that occur in open systems, like say enhanced rock weathering, are more difficult to monitor and verify with precision because they are in open, uncertain ecosystems, right? Versus sort of direct air capture where you're removing something from the atmosphere and you can measure it with a flow meter and know exactly how much goes underground. But it could be that the former approach is, while dimensions of it are uncertain, those uncertainties are well bounded and we can use that to discount. And it could be that even with that discounting, the first approach is way cheaper than the second approach. And so this is like, we're gonna have to find a way to grapple with this. And carbon removal and carbon markets more generally, this sort of, how certain can we be about the existence of the product? If you're like buying corn and it shows up and it's bad, you know it's bad. If you're buying carbon or carbon removal, that is a fundamentally different challenge. So we're learning a lot, but we also have a lot more to learn, and really grateful for the Market Shaping Accelerator for all of the work and thought leadership.
Great, thanks. So I want to come back to all of you. I mean, over time you've all worked in government. I know, Kath, you've seen, governments trying to implement incentives up close and personal, both in the UK and Australia. I'm going to ask you about failures, because we've talked about kind of what the perfect would look like. But we've also need to learn from where governments have got things wrong in the past in trying to set incentives. So I'll turn to Kath first to talk a little. Where have you seen things go wrong? What should we avoid going forward?
When I think about this net zero challenge, and I've been working on it since 2001, there's been quite a few missteps and failures. And I'm going to give you 2 or 3 examples from my experience. So the first, people talk about setting a price on carbon. Whenever you talk to an economist, that's the first thing they always tell me to do. And so if you think, I'm back in 2002 in the UK, Tony Blair was the Prime Minister, and we weren't actually allowed to talk about a target for carbon reduction. It was an ambitious goal of 80%. And that was the policy language we were allowed to use. And they said, we want to use the market though, so why don't, and the economist said, let's do an emissions trading scheme. And the UK did the first one, they will tell you, to the EU, and then the EU did theirs. But the UK one was really a trial. And actually what we did is we got companies in a room. There were 2 policy people working on carbon at that point in the government. And there was 1,000 companies that we wanted to trial in this emissions trading scheme in sectors. And I will tell you, we got it wrong because we set the cap too low. And I'll say a famous chocolate company in the UK, which I won't mention the name, but their head of energy came to me after the first couple of years and said, we're really embarrassed. We had all these energy efficiency measures that made good business sense. We just didn't know about that. And so they started to do the reductions because it made their profitability improve regardless of the carbon scheme. And it took the EU probably 2 or 3 goes at getting better knowledge on what was the emissions on each of those companies, because no one reported it back then. Scope 1, 2 and 3, WRI hadn't created the protocol, so we didn't know how to measure it. There weren't people in government who really understood that. And then we had to tighten the cap. And now the EU and the new UK one work very efficiently, but it took us quite a while to learn how to do that. The second example, and I was working with Rachel on looking at reforestation RED projects in Colombia, and the LEAF program, which was supported by Amazon. And that's a RED Plus scheme, so looking at carbon offsets. And I think market instruments in countries where you've got conflict, like Brazil, Colombia, Indonesia, to save the planet with climate, you have to protect the Amazon rainforest and the Indonesian and the Congo Basin. Increasingly, I think we need to be a lot simpler in the mechanisms we're designing in those countries and paying the governments to save the forest. Because I don't think if you don't have good land rights, you can't have a carbon offsetting scheme, you can't have permanence, if you're changing. And so I think that's a really interesting area to think about, just being a bit more simple in our policy making in those countries. The second area where I think we've learnt a lot is grant schemes for the push versus pull. So in Australia, it's 1 in 4 households in Australia have solar on their roofs. But many states in Australia paid grants to put solar on your roof. And at one point, retirees were putting solar in their backyards because they were making money from it and putting back to the grid. But the grid didn't need that energy. And so again, what the government did there is they cut off those schemes really quickly then. But that then stopped the industry and the innovation. So I think the introduction and how you do it is also really key in terms of, what industry do you want to build up in a country. And the third one I'll come on to is when I was at the Carbon Trust, we were funded by government to do early stage venture capital in low carbon technologies. And we're like, there'll be loads of technologies. We were so wrong. I remember the first competition we put out, we basically got no applications because people didn't know what it was. And I know some of the technologies we supported in those early days, like tidal stream. If any of you have sailed around the UK, it has very strong tides. Well, the technology, but they put it in, but it would float away. It was never going to work at scale to be competitive with parity, grid parity, which is the key. So we should have really done a lot more thinking, which is your question, what are you trying to solve for? And we now know in energy and low carbon, what we're looking for is being competitive with gas or the incumbent technology. But at the time, we weren't really thinking that way. So there's a few war stories more than anything else. But if you think about what you're looking for is better information to design the policy. What's the outcome you're trying to achieve? So, in the case of energy, it's lowering the cost of the technology. But also what innovation or what industry, what's the industry ecosystem you were saying, the 1,000 companies now working on carbon capture and the like. That's really key to understand.
So I know we're running out of time, but any quick war stories or warnings that you want to give about?
Sure, I'll do a couple quickly. Well, it's not really war stories. Let me just make 3 quick points. The first is that came up in a previous panel, the idea of contracting and relationship, and that's when we as a government do that well, and I think we did for some of the vaccine development for COVID, it was very enabling. And I think in other aspects, our government does that. There are examples where we haven't done that very well, where it's the cumbersome process of getting a government contract is a disincentive for a company to participate in our processes. And so the idea of us figuring out how we do contracts well came up in the first panel, and that deeply resonated with me. Second point of it is, I wouldn't say a failure, but what we have traditionally done as we think about infectious diseases and pandemics and health in general is that we've over-specialized, and that we have created we've divided the human body by saying, okay, cardiology is the heart and gastroenterology is the stomach and all these things that are incredibly artificial distinctions. And we've done this where we've specialized, and we've actually created entire government processes that are so deliberately defined, that have created such deliberate stovepipes that they don't make sense anymore. And I think a perfect example for this group is what you've talked about with the pneumococcal vaccine. So you'll say the pneumococcal, that's a bacteria that can cause pneumonia that can be deadly. But it's not necessarily thought of all of the wonderful work you did on the pneumococcal vaccine. A lot of people would say, well, that's not really pandemic preparedness because, well, it's not really a pandemic. Similarly, all of the great work that's been done to control, not eliminate and eradicate, but to control HIV with programs such as PEPFAR is considered global health and considered HIV, but that's not considered pandemic preparedness because, well, that's a different type of thing. And what we want to do going forward is essentially conflate all of those things together. And the point that we make fundamentally is that as we get better as a system in the development of vaccines and going the last mile so that everyone who needs a vaccine gets that vaccine, whether it's a vaccine for measles or pneumococcus or for a future COVID pandemic, it's the same process. As we get good at vaccines, the more that we will be prepared for future pandemics. And that actually means that we conflate a lot of things that we've traditionally said are global health and that are pandemic preparedness and that are immuno-oncology into one process. And I think the market shaping efforts that you will do in pandemic preparedness can also have massive positive impact on global health as well.
Great, thanks.
2 quick things. One, we're not great at failing quickly as a government. And by that I mean ending projects that aren't working. And I think that requires a number of things. 1, like much clearer articulation of goals at the outset. 2, much clearer metrics for establishing whether these things are working or not over time. And 3, and critically importantly, a political context that can accommodate the admission of failure and clearer articulation at the outset of the value of failure for innovation. And then the second thing I'll say, and this is like a broader sort of mistake I think we've made in climate politics and policy more generously, is fetishizing efficiency at the expense of effectiveness and paying insufficient attention to like the quite real political constraints on climate action. And I think I'm going to turn this into not a failure but a win. I think the Inflation Reduction Act is like a very refreshing and exciting counterexample of that.
Great, thank you. I'm going to call on Chris to close this out.
So as you see, we're keen here to engage with policymakers, philanthropists, innovators, experts. So please reach out to our team. You see our website there, marketshaping.uchicago.edu. We're launching our Innovation Challenge next week, so please consider submitting an entry to that. We're hoping to surface the highest impact problems to try to tackle and spread the word to your colleagues. So as we saw and as we've discussed, climate change and pandemic risk are serious threats, but we're not resting. We're going to try to rise to the challenge. We can shape markets to deliver the innovation that society most needs. We look forward to working on this problem and look forward to working with many of you on this. So thank you very much.